The collar was crooked. Elsie noticed it before she even raised her eyes to his face. She was kneeling on the cold stone floor, gathering the broken pieces of the copper pitcher she had dropped while retreating too quickly in the narrow corridor, when the procession entered through the north portal of the grand hall. Heavy boots, travel cloaks still carrying the dust of long roads pressed into dark fabric, the scent of pine, cured leather, and something deeper, earth after rain, burning wood, the unmistakable scent of high-blooded wolves moving in formation. She was not supposed to be there. The north wing was reserved for the arrival of delegations. No maid was permitted to cross that corridor during the hour of solemn entry. The rule existed for exactly this reason, so that the Alpha King and his court did not have to navigate around women on their knees picking up broken crockery. But the pitcher had rolled exactly in that direction, and Elsie had run after it without thinking, because that copper pitcher belonged to Lady Holt. And Lady Holt had made it very clear that same morning, in the flat, practiced tone she used for announcements that were not open to discussion, that any object damaged under Elsie's watch would be taken from her wages. The whole month. Not a portion. The whole month. So there she was, kneeling on the floor, shards pressing into her palms, and boots stopping less than a foot from her right knee. She did not raise her face immediately. Maids learn that before they learn anything else. Do not look up unless necessary. Pretend the floor is the entire world. Make yourself small, invisible, a piece of furniture that happens to breathe. The trick was not just to lower your eyes, but to lower your entire presence, to compress yourself inward, until the person above you simply stopped registering you as something worth looking at. Elsie had spent years perfecting this. But then someone stopped. Not the entire procession, just one man. She knew because the rhythm of the footsteps around her continued moving forward. The sound of boots on stone flowing past like water around a rock. And a single pair of boots went absolutely still. Get up. Something inside her said it with the same urgency of someone warning about an approaching flame. Get up now, before he decides you are a problem. She stood. Too quickly. The broken pitcher rattled in her hands. One shard escaped and struck the floor with a sharp metallic sound that echoed through the entire length of the corridor, and it was exactly in that moment, off balance, startled, completely without the careful composure she had spent years constructing, that she raised her eyes without meaning to. Because the survival reflex is faster than etiquette, and she saw the crooked collar. The man before her was tall. Very tall. In the way that certain alphas are tall. Not just in height, but in the way they occupy space, as though the air around them has been rearranged to accommodate their presence. He wore a charcoal travel cloak over a dark tunic with fine embroidery along the neck, and that neck was slightly misaligned to the right side, the inner collar folded outward in an uneven way. It was the kind of detail that passes completely unnoticed by anyone who has never spent their days dressing. Lords, adjusting lapels, smoothing fabric over shoulders that do not stay still, the kind of detail that becomes invisible, unless your hands have been trained to find it the way a musician's ear finds a note slightly off pitch. Elsie's hands had been trained to find exactly that. Her fingers moved before her mind could order otherwise. It was a single motion, automatic. Her right hand rose, her fingers closed gently on the edge of the collar, folded the lapel back into its correct position, aligned the left edge over the right. With the precise pressure of someone who has performed this gesture so many times, it has become part of breathing. She felt the fabric settle. Correct. Smooth. Then her hand was still in the air. And the silence arrived. It lasted 3 full breaths. She counted them without meaning to, because counting was something to do when the mind refuses to process what the body has just committed. Then Elsie understood what she had done. Her blood went cold from the crown of her head downward, like ice water finding every path through her body at once. She had just touched the Alpha King, not a visiting lord passing through the lower hall, not a high-ranking beta who might accept the contact with mild irritation and a sharp word before moving on. The emblem on the chest of the travel cloak, a wolf's head encircled by a crown of iron thorns, worked in dark thread so fine it almost disappeared into the fabric at a distance, told her everything she had failed to register before. She had seen that emblem on banners hung from the eastern parapets during state occasions, on the wax seals of documents that passed through the castle in the hands of breathless messengers, on the shields of the royal guard who had ridden through the lower village 3 seasons ago, and every person in the market had stopped what they were doing and stood very still until the procession passed. King Calum of the Iron Range, ruler of the 5 northern packs, commander of the largest wolf coalition in living memory, the man who had consolidated 3 warring bloodlines without a single open battle, through a combination of strategy, dominance, and a reputation for absolute patience that somehow frightened people more than fury ever could. He was not a king who shouted. He was a king who waited. And according to every whispered account that had ever drifted down through the servant corridors of Ashford Castle, the waiting was the part that undid people. Elsie's right hand was still suspended near his collar. She lowered it. Around her, she could feel the weight of multiple gazes pressing in from all sides. Not the polite discomfort of witnessing an awkward moment between strangers. The sharp, calibrated attention of trained wolves reading a situation for threat or intent, scanning the air for aggression, cataloging every detail of the woman kneeling on the floor with broken copper in her left hand and her right hand raised toward their king's throat. Someone behind Calum made a sound low in his chest, not a growl exactly, a vibration. The kind that lands somewhere below conscious hearing and triggers something older than thought. Elsie did not look at whoever had made it. She kept her eyes on the floor and spoke before the silence could harden into something worse. "Your Majesty." Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "Forgive me. I was not paying attention to where I was. I should not be in this corridor. I will remove myself immediately." She took 1 step back. The collar. His voice stopped her completely, low, unhurried. The kind of voice that does not reach for volume, because volume is for men who are not certain they will be heard. He was certain. The certainty was simply there, the same way the weight of the stone walls was simply there, not announced, not argued, just present. It was crooked, not a question. A fact being confirmed, placed on a surface between them like an object being examined. Elsie kept her eyes down. "Yes, Your Majesty." A pause. "How long have you served in this household?" The question arrived without warning, and she felt the wrongness of it. Not the content, but the direction. Kings arriving for state visits do not stop to ask maids about their years of service. They do not stop at all. The fact that he had, the fact that he was still standing there while his entire delegation waited at his back, meant something she could not yet interpret. 4 years, Your Majesty. I came to Ashford Castle when I was 19. She kept her voice flat and even, the way she had learned to keep it when someone of consequence directed attention at her without warning. Flat voices do not invite follow-up questions. I work under Lady Holt. I manage the guest chambers in the East Wing and assist with formal dressing on ceremonial occasions. Another silence. Longer. Your name. The shards pressed into her palm. She concentrated on that small, specific pain because it was something solid, something outside the strange suspension of the moment. Elsie, Your Majesty. Just Elsie. Yes, Your Majesty. She heard something shift in the air behind the king. Not movement exactly, more like the subtle adjustment of attention among the men standing at his back. A collective recalibration that she felt in her skin before she heard anything. One of them exhaled slowly. Look at me. Every instinct she had developed over 23 years of living at the bottom of every room she had ever entered rose up at once against that instruction. Looking up was dangerous. Making eye contact with power was the fastest way to become visible to it, and visible was the last thing a maid with no family name, no pack standing, no wolf of consequence anywhere behind her should ever choose to be. Invisible was safe. Invisible meant passing through rooms without consequence. Invisible meant keeping her wages and her position, and the narrow, careful life she had constructed around both, but he had not said it with the tone of a request. So she looked up. King Calum was watching her with an expression she could not name. Not cold, not warm, not curious in any way she recognized from the lords and visiting nobles she had dressed and served, and moved around silently for 4 years. His eyes were a shade of gray that reminded her of the mountain sky in late autumn. That specific moment when the clouds have settled and the light has gone flat, and the first snow is deciding whether or not to fall. He was perhaps 30, perhaps slightly older. It was difficult to know with alphas of old bloodlines, who aged the way stone aged, accumulating density rather than showing years. There was a scar along his jaw, pale and long since healed, that disappeared beneath the edge of his collar. The collar she had straightened without permission. He looked at her steadily, then, and this was the part she would return to later, in the quiet of the servants' dormitory, when sleep refused to come. His eyes moved very briefly to the collar itself, a glance of less than a second, almost nothing. It needed straightening, he said. And then he walked past her. The procession resumed, boots on stone, the heavy displaced air of large men in travel clothes moving through a narrow space, the smell of pine and cold road and wolf scent that lingered even after the bodies were gone. One of his men passed so close that his cloak brushed her arm. The last one paused. She did not look up this time. A word, this one said quietly. His voice carried a thread of amusement in it, fine and deliberate, like someone who has learned to use humor the way other men use knives, lightly, with precision, with the full understanding of what it can do. Next time you reach for a king's collar, you might consider checking the crest on his cloak before your hands move. He did not wait for an answer. Elsie stood in the empty corridor long after the last echo of boots had faded into the stone. The broken pitcher was still in her hands. The cold was still rising through the floor. The torches on the walls burned without sound, indifferent, the way fire always is. She did not move for a long moment. Something had happened. She could not name it, and she could not measure it, but she had spent enough years reading rooms to know when the air in one had changed. Something had shifted in that corridor, quietly, without ceremony, the way the first fracture appears in river ice in the early days of spring. Invisible from above, structural, already deciding the shape of everything that will follow. She did not yet know what it meant. She only knew that the Alpha King had looked at her, and she had not looked away. The East Wing guest chambers required 3 hours of preparation before a delegation of that size could be considered ready. Elsie knew this because she was the one who prepared them. She had been back in the corridor behind the kitchens for less than 10 minutes, long enough to deposit the broken pieces of the copper pitcher in the waste bin and say nothing to anyone about where she had been. When Lady Holt appeared at the end of the passage like something summoned by the specific frequency of things going wrong. She was a tall woman, angular in the way that certain people become angular when authority has lived in their body long enough. All sharp lines and compressed impatience, her gray hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to be holding her expression in place. "The North Chambers," Lady Holt said, without preamble, without greeting, in the way she said most things. "The king's personal staff requires 4 rooms on the upper level. The king himself takes the ironwood chamber. You will prepare it." Elsie looked at her. "The ironwood chamber is the largest guest room in the castle," she said carefully. Lord Ashford's steward is managing the great hall for tonight's reception." Lady Holt's eyes moved over Elsie with the particular efficiency of someone assessing a tool rather than a person. "You know that chamber better than anyone. You cleaned it for the last 3 state visits. You will do it now. And you will do it without incident." A pause, sharp as a pin. "I am told there was an incident in the north corridor this afternoon." The air in the passage went very still. "I dropped a pitcher," Elsie said. "I retrieved the pieces. No damage to the floor." Lady Holt looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. "See, that dropping things is the worst of it," she said finally, and turned away. The ironwood chamber was on the uppermost level of the east wing, at the end of a corridor lined with narrow windows that looked out over the forest. In the gray light of late afternoon, the trees beyond the glass were the color of iron, and the sky above them was the color of old pewter, and the whole landscape had the quality of something holding its breath. Elsie had always found the chamber itself difficult to read. It was the finest room in Ashford Castle. That much was obvious from the carved bed frame, the tapestries on the walls depicting old hunting scenes in deep red and green, the fireplace large enough to stand in, the writing desk of actual ironwood that had given the room its name, and that was worth more than everything Elsie owned combined. But there was something about the proportions of it, the way the ceiling was slightly too high, and the windows slightly too narrow that made it feel less like a room meant for comfort and more like a room meant for something else. Assessment, maybe. The architecture of a place where important men came to think. She built the fire first because the stone held cold like a living thing, and the delegation had ridden from the Iron Range, which meant they had been in mountain weather for at least 4 days. Then she changed the bed linens, smoothed the coverlet, checked the candles in their iron holders along the walls. She filled the water basin from the heated pail she had carried up from the kitchens, set out fresh cloth, arranged the small table near the fire with a carafe of dark wine from the castle cellars and 2 clean cups. She was adjusting the position of the wine carafe, slightly left, so it would catch the firelight and look less stark against the bare wood, when she became aware that she was not alone. She did not hear anyone enter. That was the first thing she registered. The door had not opened, the floorboards had not shifted. But the quality of the air in the room had changed, and she had been around wolves long enough to know what that change meant, before any of her other senses confirmed it. She turned around. There were 2 of them. They had come in through the side door, the narrow servants' entrance in the far wall that she had left unlatched for her own access, and that she had, in the distraction of the afternoon, failed to relock behind her. They were not the king. She knew that immediately. They were young, both of them, perhaps mid-20s, in the leather and dark wool of the king's personal guard, with the iron thorn emblem worked into the clasps at their shoulders. One was leaning against the wall near the servants' door with his arms folded, watching her with the expression of someone who has been waiting longer than he would have preferred. The other was standing closer, near the writing desk, running one finger along the edge of the ironwood surface, with apparent interest in the grain. The maid from the corridor, the one near the desk, said. He was the one with the amused voice. She recognized it immediately. The same fine thread of deliberate humor she had heard when he paused beside her in the procession. Up close, he was sharp-featured and dark-haired, with the kind of face that would have been conventionally handsome if the expression on it were ever entirely serious, which it clearly was not. I told Riven you would be the one they sent up here. He didn't believe me. The one against the wall, Riven, apparently, said nothing. He was broader than the first, quieter in every sense, with pale eyes that moved over the room and over Elsie in the same systematic way, cataloging without commenting. I am preparing the chamber, Elsie said. She kept her voice level. If you are part of the king's personal staff, I can finish and leave so that you may— We're not here for the chamber. The dark-haired one pulled his finger from the desk and straightened up. We're here because the king's beta is currently standing outside that door. He gestured toward the main chamber entrance. And he has decided, in his considerable wisdom, that you should not be in this room when the king arrives. Elsie looked at the main door, then back at him. The beta, she said. Armed, Riven said from the wall. It was the first word he had spoken, and he said it with the calm specificity of someone providing a relevant detail. Don't enter the carriage, she stared at him. I beg your pardon? It's an expression. The dark-haired one, she still did not have his name, waved a hand. It means the situation outside that door is less welcoming than the situation in here. Cade takes his position very seriously. He has opinions about who occupies spaces before the king does, and those opinions are— he searched briefly— firm. I was assigned to this room by Lady Holt, Elsie said, and Cade was assigned to that door by the king. The interesting question is which assignment carries more weight. He tilted his head. I know which one I would bet on. From beyond the main door, she heard footsteps. Measured, deliberate footsteps that stopped directly outside. Then a voice. Low, clipped, carrying the particular texture of authority that has been exercised so consistently it has become a physical quality. The chamber should be clear. Elsie recognized, with a cold and specific clarity, that she was now trapped between a beta who did not want her in the room and a servant's door guarded by 2 men who found the situation entertaining. She picked up the empty water pail. She smoothed her apron. She turned toward the servant's door with all the composure she had in her, which at that particular moment was less than she would have preferred but more than nothing. Excuse me, she said to the dark-haired one. He stepped aside, with a small, almost imperceptible inclination of his head that seemed genuine beneath the amusement, which surprised her. She was 2 steps from the servant's door when it opened from the other side. King Calum walked in, He had changed out of the travel cloak. He wore a simpler tunic now, dark, with no embroidery, and his hair was slightly damp at the temples as though he had washed the road off his face. He looked, in this context, without the formality of the procession and the weight of the assembled court, almost like a man rather than an institution, almost. He stopped when he saw her. She stopped when she saw him. Behind her, the main door opened, and she heard the beta enter. Cade, the armed one, the one who had decided she should not be here. And she could feel his attention land on her back like a hand pressed flat between her shoulder blades. She was finishing the room, the dark-haired guard said from somewhere to her left, with the tone of someone providing helpful context before anyone asks for it. King Calum looked at the room, at the fire, built and burning well, at the bed, smoothed and turned back correctly, at the wine carafe, positioned in the firelight. He looked at these things with the same quality of attention she had noticed in the corridor. Thorough, unhurried, the assessment of someone who has trained himself to look at things as they actually are, rather than as he expects them to be. Then he looked at Elsie. "The collar was straight this morning," he said. "Now the room is ready." It was not precisely gratitude. It was not precisely anything she had a word for. It landed somewhere between observation and acknowledgement. In a register she had never heard a man of his standing use with her before. She managed a small, correct curtsy, the water pail still in her hand. "Good evening, Your Majesty." She walked through the servants' door. Behind her, just before the door closed, she heard the dark-haired guard say something in a low voice that she could not fully make out. And then, quieter still, barely carrying through the wood, a sound that might have been the beginning of something almost like a laugh. From a man whose face, she was nearly certain, very rarely made that sound at all. The reception that evening filled the great hall with the kind of noise that has weight to it. Elsie heard it from the servants' corridor that ran along the eastern wall, a narrow passage behind the tapestries where maids moved during formal events like shadows behind a lit curtain, carrying trays and refilling carafes, and making themselves useful without making themselves visible. The sound came through the stone in waves, voices layered over voices, the deep resonance of wolf lords in formal gathering, the occasional sharp ring of a cup against the long tables, music from the gallery above playing something old and ceremonial that nobody was actually listening to. She had been assigned to the corridor service for the evening. Lady Holt's decision, delivered without explanation, which meant either punishment for the broken pitcher or something else entirely. With Lady Holt, it was frequently both. The passage was cold, the tapestries were thick, but the stone behind them held the night air from the outer walls, and Elsie had been moving back and forth along that corridor for 2 hours with a tray of refilled wine cups, her breath faintly visible in the chill, her feet learning the uneven places in the floor by memory. She was not supposed to look through the gaps in the tapestries. She looked through the gaps in the tapestries. The great hall of Ashford Castle was not the grandest hall she had ever heard described, but it was impressive in the way that functional things are impressive. Built for purpose, for the gathering of packs and the conduct of alliances, with long stone tables and iron chandeliers hanging on chains from the vaulted ceiling, their candles throwing warm, unsteady light over the faces of men and women who had ridden from considerable distances to be present. The banners of 3 allied packs hung from the upper gallery. The Ashford banner, a silver stag on blue, occupied the center, flanked by the visiting delegations on either side. The Iron Range banner was on the left. Black field, iron thorn crown, the wolf's head she had seen on Calum's cloak rendered in silver thread large enough to be read from the far end of the hall. It hung without movement in the still indoor air, and somehow it managed to look more permanent than the others, the way certain things look as though they were always there, and everything else was arranged around them. Calum sat at the high table. Elsie found him before she found anything else, which she noted and filed away in the category of things she would not examine too closely. He was between Lord Ashford, the castle's aging lord, broad and red-faced and currently talking with the energetic determination of a man compensating for nervousness, and an empty chair that had been placed with deliberate spacing, the kind of spacing that announces someone's absence more loudly than their presence would. He was listening to Lord Ashford with the quality of attention she had already come to associate with him in the extremely limited sample of their acquaintance. Complete, unhurried, giving nothing away. The dark-haired guard was at the far end of the high table, and he was apparently telling a story to two of the Ashford lord's younger sons, who were both leaning forward with the expressions of people who had been warned to be on their best behavior and were currently losing the battle against genuine interest. She watched him gesture broadly with a wine cup that was definitely not his first of the evening, and felt, despite herself, a flicker of amusement. Riven stood behind the king's chair. He did not sit. He did not eat. He stood with his hands at his sides and his pale eyes moving over the room in slow, continuous passes, the way a lighthouse beam moves over water. Not looking for anything specific, looking for everything at once. She watched him complete 3 full sweeps of the hall before she made herself stop watching and go back to her tray. It was on her 4th pass through the corridor that she heard her name, not loudly. Not in the way her name was usually spoken in this castle, which was with the flat efficiency of a task being assigned. It came through a gap in the tapestry from somewhere near the side entrance of the hall. 2 voices speaking at a register they clearly believed was private, which it would have been for anyone standing more than 4 feet away. Elsie was standing approximately 3 feet away, and she had stopped moving because the tray had developed an imbalance she was correcting. The girl from the corridor, a woman's voice. High, dry, with the particular precision of someone accustomed to being overheard by inferiors, and not caring. I heard about it from Cade. She put her hands on him. She adjusted his collar. A different voice. Male, older, the measured cadence of a castle official. Hardly the same thing, in full view of the delegation, without permission, without rank or standing of any kind. A pause, and in the pause, Elsie heard the controlled edge of something that was trying to present itself as concern. Lady Holt should handle it before it becomes a story. The king did not appear to find it offensive. The king's reaction is precisely what concerns me. Another pause. She has no pack, no family of note, no standing in any of the 5 territories. Whatever interest she attracted this afternoon, it should be discouraged before it settles into something inconvenient. Elsie stood very still. She was not, in general, a woman who allowed herself anger. Anger was expensive. It cost more than it returned, especially for someone in her position, and she had learned early that the emotions you could least afford were the ones most easily provoked. But there was something about hearing herself described in the language of inconvenience, not as a person, not as someone who had committed an actual wrong, but as a variable in someone else's calculation, that moved through her, like heat, through iron. She adjusted the tray. She straightened her back. She walked. She had covered perhaps 10 feet of corridor when the tapestry to her left shifted, not from a gap. The whole panel moved, pushed from the hall side, and the dark-haired guard stepped through it with the ease of someone who had clearly located the servants' corridor some time ago and found the discovery useful. He looked at her, then at her face. Then he tilted his head slightly, the amusement in his expression adjusting into something more attentive. "You heard something unpleasant," he said. It was not a question. "I am working," Elsie said. "You are working, and you heard something unpleasant." He fell into step beside her, which she had not invited, and which he clearly had not required an invitation for. "The acoustics in this hall are genuinely treacherous. I speak from experience. I once heard a very detailed description of my own table manners from 40 feet away. A beat. The description was accurate, which made it worse. Despite everything, something in her chest loosened slightly. She did not smile, but the impulse was there. "Your name," she said, because she was tired of thinking of him as the dark-haired guard. "Fennec," he said, "advisor to the king, which mostly means I say things in rooms where saying them directly would be impolitic." He glanced at the tray she was carrying. "And you are Elsie, who straightens collars and hears things through walls. We are both, in our own ways, operating in the margins of important rooms." She looked at him sideways. That is a generous way to describe the difference between an advisor to a king and a maid carrying wine. Generous, maybe, also accurate. He stopped walking when they reached the junction where the servants' corridor branched toward the kitchen passage. "The woman who was speaking, you should know that her concern is not about propriety." He said it quietly, the humor entirely absent now, with the directness of someone switching registers without apology. "She is the mother of the man Lord Ashford intended to position beside the king this evening. The empty chair at the high table was meant for her son. The king declined the seating arrangement." Elsie looked at him. "Why are you telling me this?" Fenwick considered the question with what appeared to be genuine attention. "Because you should understand the shape of the room you are currently in," he said. "And because you struck me, in the corridor this afternoon, as someone who prefers to understand the shape of rooms." He went back through the tapestry. Elsie stood at the junction for a moment, the tray balanced in her hands, the cold coming through the stone walls, the noise of the hall continuing on the other side of the fabric as though nothing at all had shifted. Then she heard from somewhere above and behind her, from the direction of the passage that connected the servants' corridor to the upper gallery, a sound that did not belong, quiet, deliberate. The specific quality of someone standing in an elevated position and being very still. She did not look up, but she knew, with the wordless certainty of a body that has learned to read spaces for safety, that someone was there. And she knew, without evidence she could name, without logic she could construct, that whoever was standing in that gallery above the servants' corridor had been there for longer than the moment she had noticed. She walked toward the kitchen passage. Behind her she heard nothing. But the air had that quality again, the one from the corridor that afternoon, the one she did not yet have a name for. The quality of something that had already decided its direction, moving forward the way rivers move forward, not because anyone has asked them to, but because the shape of the land allows for nothing else. She did not look back. The morning after a state reception at Ashford Castle began the same way every morning began, with the bells from the North Tower marking the 5th hour, and every maid in the servants' dormitory rising before the 6th. Elsie was already awake when the bells rang. She had not slept particularly well. Not because of distress exactly, but because of the particular restlessness that comes when the mind has gathered more information than it has had time to sort. She lay in the narrow bed in the corner of the dormitory, the corner she had occupied for 4 years, close to the window because she preferred cold air to the stuffiness of the center of the room, and stared at the ceiling and went through the shape of things methodically, the way she always did when something needed to be understood. The king had looked at her twice. Fenwick had sought her out specifically to tell her something he had not been asked to tell her. Someone had stood in the upper gallery above the servants' corridor and had said nothing, and had gone unnoticed by everyone except her. And a woman whose name she did not know had described her, to a castle official, as an inconvenience that should be handled before it settled. She sorted these facts the way she sorted linen, by category, by weight, by what they were likely to mean in practical terms. The first 2 were unusual but not yet consequential. The third she could not fully interpret. The fourth was the one that required attention, because in Elsie's experience, being identified as an inconvenience by someone with influence was the kind of thing that moved from words to action, with very little warning. She dressed in the dark and went to work. The morning's first task was the guest chambers. The delegation's staff would require fresh water and clean linens, and the king's personal rooms needed to be attended before he was awake, which meant before the 6th bell. She moved through the upper east wing with her cart. Linens, 2 heated pails, clean cloth, fresh candles, and worked her way from the smaller rooms toward the ironwood chamber at the end of the corridor. The other rooms were straightforward. She was in and out in minutes, the staff still sleeping or already gone for the early briefings that large delegations conducted at dawn. Outside the ironwood chamber, she stopped. The door was slightly open, not much, barely the width of 2 fingers, but enough to tell her that the room was occupied and the occupant was awake, which meant she should not enter, which meant she should leave the linens outside the door and come back later. She set the folded linens on the small bench beside the door and was straightening up to go when she heard it. Voices, low, from inside the room. Not conversation, something more directed than that, with the clipped rhythm of a briefing. She recognized Cade's voice, the beta, flat and precise, and beneath it, Calum's, asking a question she could not fully hear. She should have walked away. She heard her own name, not spoken loudly, not with emphasis, just placed into the sentence the way a name is placed when it is already part of the topic, and does not require introduction. Elsie, the maid from the corridor, Lady Holt's staff. And then a response from Salem that she could not make out, and then Kate again, with the measured disapproval of someone reporting an assessment he has already completed. No pack affiliation, no recorded bloodline, no standing in any of the 5 territories. A pause. Then Kylam, and this she heard clearly, because he had apparently moved closer to the door. Her scent. 2 words, that was all. Followed by silence, and then the briefing resuming about something else entirely, supply routes or meeting schedules or the logistics of the day's formal agenda. Elsie stood in the corridor with the empty cart. Her scent. She did not know what to do with that. Wolf Lords spoke about scent the way other people spoke about reputation, as something real and structural, something that carried information the way documents carried information, something that could not be faked or altered or improved by good behavior. She had grown up knowing this in the abstract way that people who are not wolves know things about wolves, which is to say distantly and without full comprehension of the weight of it. She picked up the cart and walked. Mara found her at the linen press on the lower level an hour later. Mara was the only person in Ashford Castle who had known Elsie before Ashford Castle, before the 4 years of quiet service, before the corner bed and the copper pitchers and the careful, invisible life. They had grown up in the same village at the edge of the eastern foothills, the kind of village that does not appear on formal maps but exists nonetheless, populated by humans and low-blood wolves and the various people who did not fit comfortably into the hierarchies of the larger territories. Mara had come to the castle 2 years after Elsie, following the same narrow path of necessity, and she worked in the laundry, and she was the one person to whom Elsie did not have to explain the subtext of things. "You look like someone who spent the night doing mathematics," Mara said, taking the other handle of the linen press without being asked. "I'm fine. You're fine the way the castle well is fine in winter, functional but cold, and nobody wants to look too closely at what's inside." Mara glanced at her sideways. She was small and brown-haired, and possessed of an extremely accurate instinct for when Elsie was managing something alone that she should not be managing alone. "I heard about the corridor." Elsie looked at her. "Everyone heard about the corridor," Mara said, not unkindly. "Hannah from the East Kitchens told Breda, and Breda told everyone. The maid who touched the king," she paused. "Which is not, for the record, how I would have phrased it if I were Hannah." I adjusted his collar. "I know what you did. I am explaining what it became by the time it reached the laundry." Mara set her end of the press down and turned to face her properly. "Else, what is actually happening?" Elsie told her. Not everything, not the gallery, not the 2 words she had heard through the door, because those were not yet things she could say out loud without feeling that saying them would change their weight somehow. But the procession, the collar, the ironwood chamber, Fennec, the woman's voice through the tapestry. She told it in order, flatly, the way she told Mara things when she needed the outside perspective of someone who would not dramatize. Mara listened without interrupting, which was one of her best qualities. When Elsie finished, Mara was quiet for a moment. "The woman," she said finally. "The one who called you an inconvenience." "I don't know her name." "I do." Mara's voice was careful. "That's Lady Voss. She came with the Ashford party from the Southern Holdings, arrived 2 days before the delegation. Her son is Rendell Voss. He's been positioned as a potential match for one of the Northern Alliance seats for the last 8 months." A pause. "He was the empty chair at the high table." Elsie absorbed this. "The king declined the seating arrangement," she said, mostly to herself, echoing what Fennec had told her. "The king declined several things Lord Ashford proposed," Mara said quietly. "That's what the Kitchens are saying. The whole visit was arranged around a specific set of alliance terms, and the king arrived and began declining things before the first meal was served." She looked at Elsie steadily. "People are trying to understand why." The linen press sat between them, the folded cloth stacked neat and white and indifferent. "It has nothing to do with me," Elsie said. Mara did not say anything, which was, in its own way, a kind of answer. She encountered Rendell Voss for the first time that afternoon, in the East Corridor, and she understood immediately why the empty chair at the high table had carried the specific quality of announced absence. He was the kind of man who expected to be noticed. Tall, well-dressed, with the groomed confidence of someone who has been told since childhood that rooms should arrange themselves around his arrival. He was perhaps 28, with the build of a trained wolf and the expression of one who has never seriously been refused anything. He was standing in the corridor outside the ironwood chamber when she came around the corner with fresh candles, and he was not alone. 2 of his own men flanked him, and he was looking at the king's door with the particular quality of attention that is not quite a stare, but is not casual either. He noticed her when she was perhaps 6 feet away. His eyes moved over her with the unhurried assessment of someone who does not bother to conceal that he is assessing. Then something shifted in his expression. Not interest exactly, not attraction, but the sharper, specific attention of recognition. He had heard about the corridor. She could see it in the recalibration of his gaze, the way it moved from dismissal to something more calculating. "You're the maid," he said. "I work in this wing, my lord." She kept walking. "I heard you made quite an impression yesterday." His voice followed her, carrying the particular quality of words spoken at a volume that is chosen deliberately, loud enough for his men to hear, quiet enough to seem private. "Interesting approach for someone in your position." She stopped. She should not have stopped. But something in the phrasing, "someone in your position," landed in the same place that the woman's voice through the tapestry had landed the night before, in the part of her that had learned to absorb that register of dismissal, and had apparently, somewhere in the last 24 hours, begun to absorb it less gracefully than usual. She turned. "I was doing my work, my lord," she said. Evenly, correctly, with every inflection precisely placed. "As I am doing now." He looked at her with an expression that was almost amused, but not in the way Fennec was amused. This was the amusement of someone who has found a small, unexpected resistance in something that should have been pliable. "Of course," he said. She turned back and walked. Behind her, she heard one of his men say something low, and Rendell Voss laugh in response, and she kept her pace exactly steady, because changing it would tell him something she was not prepared to give him. She was 3 steps from the turn in the corridor when a door opened, not the ironwood chamber's main door. The servant's entrance in the side wall. Riven stepped out. He stood in the corridor with the stillness she had already come to associate with him, his pale eyes moving from Elsie to Rendell Voss, and his 2 men with the slow, systematic attention of someone completing an assessment that had already produced a conclusion. He said nothing, but he did not move back through the door either. He simply stood there, and the quality of his standing, the weight of it, the absolute absence of uncertainty in it, changed the texture of the corridor entirely. Rendell Voss's expression shifted. Barely, but she saw it. After a moment, Voss turned and walked the other direction, his men following, and the sound of their boots on stone faded around the far corner. Riven looked at Elsie. She looked at him. "Thank you," she said quietly. He gave a single, minimal nod. Then he went back through the servant's door. Elsie stood in the corridor with the candles in her hands and the specific, unfamiliar feeling of having been shielded by someone who had not been asked to do it, who had appeared without announcement and departed without ceremony, as though it were simply part of the natural order of things. She was still thinking about that when she turned the corner, and found King Calum standing at the end of the passage, still as the stone around him, watching the direction in which Rendell Voss had gone, with an expression that was not quite cold and not quite anger, but contained something of both, compressed into the quality of a decision already reached. He did not look at her immediately. When he did, it lasted only a moment, but it was enough. The formal assembly was called for the following morning. Elsie knew about it the way she knew about most things in Ashford Castle. Through the walls, through the movement of people, through the specific urgency that spreads through a servant staff when something significant is about to happen in the rooms above them. Lady Holt moved through the kitchens at dawn with her list already revised, redirecting half the morning staff to the great hall and the other half to the guest corridors, her instructions precise and her explanations absent, as always. Elsie was assigned to the great hall. She carried that assignment to the linen press, to the candle stores, to the preparation table, and said nothing about it to anyone. But Mara found her in the corridor before the 7th bell, and held her by the arm for just a moment, long enough to say, "They are signing something today, or not signing it, and whatever happens will change the shape of the next 10 years in the Northern Territories." Then she let go and went back to the laundry, because Mara understood that there were situations where the most useful thing a friend can do is deliver information, and then step away. The great hall had been rearranged since the reception. The long tables had been cleared to the sides, and a single table now stood at the center, formal and unadorned, with chairs for 6 and documents already placed in the middle, their wax seals intact. The iron thorn banner hung directly behind the chair, meant for the king. The Ashford stag hung opposite. Elsie moved along the walls with fresh candles, replacing the burned-down stubs from the night before, making herself part of the architecture. The lords and their advisors were filing in, taking positions standing rather than seated, the way men do when they are not yet ready to commit to the posture of agreement. Rendell Voss entered with his mother. Lady Voss was exactly as Elsie had imagined from the voice through the tapestry, angular, composed, wearing her authority in the set of her shoulders. She moved to the far side of the room with the practiced ease of someone who has attended many assemblies and understands their geography. Her eyes found Elsie once, briefly, with the flat assessment of someone confirming that a variable is still in the room. Elsie replaced a candle and moved on. Calum entered last. He came without ceremony, no announcement, no formal procession, simply walked through the main doors with Fenwick and Riven and Cade behind him, and took his position at the table with the same quality she had observed in every other context, the quality of a man who does not require the room to acknowledge his arrival because the room already has. He sat. Everyone else sat. Lord Ashford began speaking. The formal language of alliance negotiations, the careful architecture of terms and territories and mutual recognition. Elsie moved along the far wall. She was nearly at the corner when Lord Ashford said Rendell Voss's name in the context of a proposed seat in the Northern Council, and she felt the room shift the way rooms shift when the thing that has been building finally surfaces. Calum let Lord Ashford finish. Then he said, without raising his voice, "No." The word landed in the hall like a stone in still water. Lord Ashford's color changed. Lady Voss went very still. Rendell Voss, seated 2 chairs from his mother, looked at the king with the expression of a man who has been refused something publicly for the first time in his life, and does not yet have a response for it. "The Northern Council seat requires a wolf of demonstrated judgment," Calum said. The flatness of it was worse than anger would have been. "Lord Voss has not demonstrated it. Your Majesty," Lady Voss's voice was controlled and precise, "my son's qualifications have been reviewed by... I am aware of what has been reviewed." He did not look at her. He looked at the documents on the table. "I am telling you what I have observed." The silence was complete. Elsie had stopped moving. She was standing at the corner of the hall with 2 candles in her hand, and she was watching this the way you watch something you do not fully understand but recognize as important, the way you watch weather change over the mountains. Then Calum looked up. Not at Lord Ashford, not at Lady Voss. Across the room, to the corner where Elsie stood, and the look lasted no longer than any of the other times, but it was specific, and it was deliberate, and it was witnessed by every wolf in that hall, whose attention followed the direction of a king's eyes automatically, the way flowers follow light. Every head turned. Elsie felt the weight of it like a physical thing. Rendell Voss's jaw tightened. Calum looked back at the documents. "The alliance terms stand without the council appointment," he said. "Lord Ashford, I suggest we proceed." It was Fenwick who found her afterward, in the East Corridor, which she had begun to accept as simply the way things worked. "He asked about you 3 times this morning," Fenwick said without preamble, "before the assembly, during the briefing, and once more before he walked into the hall." He paused. "I thought you should know." Elsie looked at him. Why does it matter what he asked? Fenwick was quiet for a moment, and in that moment all the humor left his face entirely, and what remained was something older and more serious. "Because he has not asked about anyone in 4 years," he said. "Not since his mate died." The corridor was cold and quiet. "And because," Fenwick continued, "we leave tomorrow. and he has asked me to determine whether Lady Holt would release a member of her staff to a position in the Iron Range household. He looked at her steadily. Specifically, 1 member. Elsie stood with the candles in her hands and felt the shape of the moment settle around her, not like a trap, not like a command, but like a door that had appeared in a wall she had long since stopped expecting to open. The choice was hers. That was the thing she understood, standing there with the cold coming through the stone, and Fennec watching her with the patience of someone who has delivered the message and will not rush the answer. "Tell him," she said finally, "that I would need to speak with him myself, not through an advisor." Fennec considered this. Then he smiled. Not the practiced curl of amusement she had come to recognize, but something smaller and more genuine. "That," he said, "is exactly the kind of answer he was hoping for." She met Calum in the ironwood chamber that evening, at his request, with the door open and Riven visible in the corridor outside, a formality that she understood was for her comfort, rather than propriety, and appreciated accordingly. He was standing at the narrow window when she entered, looking out at the forest, the trees dark against the last gray light. He turned when she came in and did not speak immediately, and she let the silence sit, because she had learned by now that his silences were not empty. "You are not afraid of me," he said finally. "I adjusted your collar," she said. "I think we established early on that my self-preservation instincts require some work." Something moved across his face. The same almost laugh she had heard through the ironwood chamber door on that first evening. Closer to the surface now. "I am not offering you a position," he said. "I am asking if you are willing to come to the Iron Range. The distinction matters to me." She looked at him for a long moment, at the scar along his jaw, at the gray eyes that looked at things as they actually were, at the man who had said no in a room full of wolves and meant it completely, and who was now standing at a window asking rather than telling, because apparently that was simply who he was. "Yes," she said. The delegation left at dawn. Mara walked with Elsie to the castle gate, carrying the small bag that contained everything Elsie owned, which was not very much, and handed it over without ceremony because Mara understood that ceremony would have made it harder. "Right," Mara said. "I will." Mara looked at her for a moment with the expression of someone who has known a person long enough to see all the way through them. "You were never meant for this castle," she said. "I knew that the first winter. You just needed someone with the right eyes to see it." Elsie held her once, briefly, and then picked up her bag and walked through the gate. The Iron Range was everything the stories had described, and nothing like she had imagined. The mountains were older than anything she had seen, and the fortress at their center had been built to last beyond the memory of the people who built it, all dark stone and deep fires, and the constant smell of pine and cold air that she came to associate, over the weeks that followed, with something she had not expected to feel again so completely: safety. The specific, structural kind that is not about the absence of danger, but about the presence of something worth standing beside. Calum did not rush anything. He was, as Fennec had once implied, and as she came to understand firsthand, a man defined by patience, not the passive patience of someone waiting for circumstances to improve, but the active patience of someone who has decided what matters and is willing to move at the speed that matters requires. He gave her time. He gave her space in the fortress that was hers and not contingent on anything. He asked her things, and listened to the answers, and remembered them. Rendell Voss made one attempt, 3 months later, to contest the Northern Council decision through a formal challenge filed with the Allied Pact Tribunal. The tribunal reviewed it for 11 days. They declined it in 4 sentences. Lady Voss left the southern holdings for an eastern territory shortly afterward, which everyone noted and nobody mourned. Kate eventually stopped standing outside doors when Elsie approached them, which Fennec declared a historic diplomatic achievement and commemorated by losing badly at cards to Riven, who had apparently been betting on the timeline. Riven said nothing about winning. He simply collected the coins with the expression of a man who had known the outcome from the beginning and had merely been waiting for everyone else to arrive at it. On the last evening of the first winter, Calum found her at the window of the high tower, the one that looked out over the full range of mountains, their peaks carrying the first snow of the season in the last light of the day. He stood beside her without speaking for a long time, and she did not speak either, because some things do not require words, and both of them had learned, by then, to recognize which things those were. After a while, he said quietly, "The collar is straight." She looked at him. "It has been," she said, "for some time." He took her hand. Outside, the snow fell over the iron range, slow and certain, covering the old ground with something clean, the mountains standing exactly as they had always stood, unchanged, unhurried, built to last. Inside, the fire burned, and that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.